So does anybody have a bird at home, like a pet bird? Couple? Okay, what kind of bird, Luke?
It's a parakeet.
A parakeet?
Yeah, parakeets.
Parakeet, yeah, that's pretty common. Okay, just curious. So birds have lots of adaptations. So you may have noticed some things as we've been working our way through these groups, from fish to amphibians to reptiles. There's a pattern to how those organisms, those groups have evolved. Okay? And you'll see the same continues as we talk about birds. There are some patterns that we see. So each group we've talked about with a body covering, whether fish with scales, amphibians with a thin skin, reptiles with scales. Obviously birds, body covering of what? Yeah, feathers. Feathers are unique to birds. No other group of vertebrates has feathers. What is the purpose of feathers? What's their function? Jenna?
It's to help them fly.
Yeah, so some feathers are adapted to flight. Like if you're walking outside and you find a feather on the ground, usually it's a flight feather, a feather from the wing. The shape of the feathers allows the wing to give it lift, and the shape of the wing gives it lift. So yeah, feathers are obviously for flight, but they have other purposes as well. Jordan?
For water protection and for heat.
Okay, so some birds have feathers that are waterproof, things like ducks and waterfowl. Also, heat. Birds have feathers that are used for insulation. And that's really important. Do you know what they're called, those types of feathers? You may have them in your jacket or a sleeping bag or a pillow.
Down.
Yeah, they're called down feathers. Like if you have a down jacket, you know what that means? It means inside the filling is tiny little feathers. Sometimes they come out and like will poke you. You pull them out, what you'll notice, it's not like a feather, you know, that you would imagine finding on the ground. It's like a small feather and it's sort of all wispy. And the reason for that is it traps air. And by trapping air, that's what insulation is. It traps heat. And so close to their skin, birds have these down feathers, which help to keep them warm. They also provide us camouflage. Some feathers are used for attracting mates. Feathers have lots of different purposes.
My brother's allergic.
Yeah. These are the tail feathers of a bird. It's like a smiley face. And you'll see them in a video we watch at some point. It's just part of their mating ritual, is the male displays those really bright tail feathers to the feet. So, do you see birds around the winter?
Right.
Here? Yeah.
Some.
You don't see as many, but yeah, there are birds, they live all winter here. Do you see any reptiles?
No.
Okay. So why do you think you see birds here but not reptiles? Sophia?
Their feathers can keep them warm, but because they're cold-blooded, they don't really, reptiles don't really as much.
Yeah. And what about them birds?
They have feathers.
Yeah, that helps them keep warm, but there's another thing. You almost would said it there. Ethan?
They're warm-blooded.
They're warm-blooded. So yeah, we don't see reptiles because they're cold-blooded. They're hibernating right now. We do see birds because they do have feathers to help insulate them, but also they're warm-blooded. And because of that, they're maintaining a high body temperature, even when it's cold outside, just like you are. Even if you go outside, you're skiing all day, your body temperature, as long as you're healthy, stays at about 98.7, even when it's cold outside, because we mammals are also warm-blooded. So birds maintain that high body temperature, and they can live in any climate, basically. Right? You see penguins, for example, live in frigid climates versus birds that live in the desert. So they can live in a wider variety of climates as compared to cold-blooded animals. But there is always a downside as well. What's the downside about being warm-blooded like that? So you can live a wide variety of climates, but, Jenna?
You need more food to get more energy.
Yes, it requires a lot more energy to maintain that body temperature. So birds need to eat a lot more than a similarly sized cold-blooded animal. How about fertilization? So we've been talking about, we had fish had external fertilization, amphibians had external fertilization, reptiles had internal. What do you think it's going to be for birds, Grace? It's actually internal. So they have internal fertilization. They're a lot like reptiles. So they have internal fertilization. Birds mate. Okay? Male bird deposits sperm inside of the female bird's reproductive tract. Those sperm cells fertilize egg cells. An egg forms around them. And the female then lays the egg. So in terms of their development, it's external. The embryo grows outside of the mother's body, inside of an egg. Okay. Now often, unlike reptiles, which usually just abandon their eggs, often birds do not. Most birds stick around. Okay, usually it's the female will incubate the eggs, keep them at the proper temperature and moisture for them to develop. So birds will often build a nest, lay their eggs in the nest, incubate them in the nest until they hatch, and then care for the young for a little while until they're independent. So if we think about the circulatory system of a bird, we have fish with a 2-chambered heart, amphibians with a 3-chambered heart, reptiles with 3.5-ish chambered heart. Where do you think we are with birds? Brandon?
4.
Yeah, they have a 4-chambered heart. 4-chambered heart is important for birds and mammals. The benefit of having a 4-chambered heart is that blood that is rich in oxygen is kept completely separate from blood that is poor in oxygen. So there's no mixing of oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. The low oxygen blood gets pumped directly to the lungs. The high oxygen blood gets pumped directly to all the other parts of the body. And so this allows for the most efficient delivery of oxygen to the cells. The maximum amount of oxygen will get to the cells in this 4-chambered heart. The right side of the heart handles the deoxygenated blood. The left side of the heart handles the oxygenated blood. Birds obviously lay eggs. And their eggs are different from reptile eggs. They have a hard shell, more brittle shell, not leathery like the reptile eggs, but it's also waterproof. It's breathable, allows oxygen and carbon dioxide to move in and out of the plant, out of the egg. So you guys just told me we do see birds around in the winter here, but not as many as we do in the spring or summer. Why not? So we know they can survive. They're warm-blooded. Eva?
They go to the south
How come?
because it's got mother.
Sort of, but they can survive in the cold, so they don't really need to be in the warmth. Savannah?
Because like in the cold, a lot of the plants that they might eat don't like bloom or like blossom, so they have to go to warmer places.
Yeah, is that they migrate generally for food. Because if it's a bird that eats insects or berries or worms, well, in the winter, you're going to be out of luck. You're not going to find much food. So many birds, species of birds, will migrate to a place where there is food available. Okay. In our area, most of them fly south to warmer climates. Some stick around though. Some birds stay throughout the winter, are able to make it with the food that they can find. But many do migrate from our area. The bones of birds are also unique. You know what's, oh, somebody mentioned it earlier. Who said it earlier? Luke, what'd you say?
They're hollow.
Yeah, they're hollow. You know, they're not as solid as a bone of a mammal, and they're very lightweight. When I took ornithology in college, studying birds, we got to pick up like a bird skeleton and a comparable like mammal skeleton. The bird skeleton is much, much lighter than the mammal skeleton. The bones sort of are hollow, but they still have strands of bone tissue inside of them that makes them still pretty strong. So you could see all those little crisscrossing bone strands. That's what helps keep them strong so that they don't fracture or break. So somebody also mentioned where birds evolved from. What's the answer? Dinosaurs, yeah, from reptiles. Birds evolved from a group of reptiles, so did mammals actually. And there's a famous fossil called Archaeopteryx. And it was a fossil that showed sort of the in-between stages from reptiles to birds. Archaeopteryx, the word itself means ancient bird, was a very, very well-preserved fossil. It was found in very fine sediment rock that preserved a great amount of detail. You could see all the individual feathers. You could see the individual blades of the feathers even, okay, in this fossil. And it showed a sort of link between reptiles and birds that was very clear. Here's what it really looks like. So you can see it has wings here. These are all preserved, the imprint of the feathers. Now it has some characteristics that were reptile-like. Like it has this long tail that has vertebrae in it. Birds today don't have that, but reptiles do. It had teeth in its jaw, like reptiles would. Okay? That's another reptile-like. Had scales on its face, okay, like a reptile. But it had feathers. Okay? Had claws at the end of its feathers. So it had sort of a mix of characteristics. It was one of those in-between fossils that showed us how birds evolved into, or reptiles evolved into birds. There's other examples, and you know, there's lots of different types of reptiles that sort of could have been the jumping off point for some of these bird ancestors. But here's just some examples of what some of those might have looked like. Oh, this was just interesting. So show some of the mating behaviors of a bird of paradise. They've been dabbing for millions of years, probably. I don't know, it doesn't show it in this video, but I'm going to guess.
Why does it do that?
Track mates.
How does it attract it?
I don't know. You may have asked yourself the same question.
I think this bird's just
time. All right. The last thing for us to talk about in terms of birds is bird eggs and the development of the chick and the embryo. So you're all, I'm sure, familiar with eggs. You've probably made eggs or baked something with eggs. So you maybe never thought about what's actually inside of an egg when you crack it. So let's just label this. We'll talk about what the different parts are, what their function is in a minute. So here we have a bird egg cross section. Okay. Obviously the outermost layer is the shell. Then inside of the shell, there's a very thin layer called the shell membrane. You know, if you ever peel a hard-boiled egg, you may know you gotta kind of, it gets stuck to the egg sometimes. You have to peel it off. Or if you look inside the shell of an egg that you cracked, there's that little sort of bubble in there that's part of the shell membrane. Obviously the yellow part of the egg is called the yolk. The egg white, that we would call egg white, the liquidy part of the egg that's clear in a raw egg and white when you cook it, its technical name is albumin. That's the name for the egg white. The thing that holds the yolk sort of together is called the yolk membrane. Does anyone cook eggs for themselves? Anyone like sunny side up eggs?
Scrambled.
Or over easy? Oh, you're trying not, when you're trying to make eggs like that, you're trying not to rupture the yolk membrane because then the yolk leaks out all over. If you're making scrambled eggs, you just break the yolk membrane and swirl it up. Now have you ever noticed if you put an egg, crack a raw egg in a bowl or something,
Yeah.
attached to the yolk are some like white stringy things? If you look closely, you'll see them, and we'll see them tomorrow when we look at eggs. They're called the chalazi, and they sort of are attached to each side of the yolk. You have the air space is at the top. It's a little bubble. Sort of, if you look in the wider end of the egg, you'll see a little bubble in there. Or if you make a hard-boiled egg, that end has like an indentation. It's not rounded. That's the air space. And then on the yolk, there will often, you can see it, if you look closely, a little patch of white on the yolk of the egg. That's called the blastoderm. Kiara?
What's the yolk bad for you? Because like some people make
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that in just a moment. So, I'll answer your question in a second. So, you talk about what the parts do. The shell of the egg, it's made mostly of calcium. What do you use calcium for, you know?
Bones.
Yeah, for your bones. Well, the same is true in the bird. The calcium from the shell is slowly absorbed by the chick to form its bones. Because as the chick is growing inside of the egg, it exhales carbon dioxide, CO2, and that mixes with water in the egg to form an acid called carbonic acid. And this acid slowly eats away at the shell, dissolving the calcium so that the chick can use it in its skeleton. Just like when we soaked our eggs in vinegar, which is also an acid, what happened to the shell?
disintegrated.
Yeah, eventually dissolved. The same is happening from the inside when carbonic acid is being produced inside of the egg. That membrane around the outside, the shell membrane, it helps keep bacteria out. Because inside the egg is actually a pretty good place for bacteria to live. That's why you're supposed to cook your eggs properly and the right temperature and so forth. So this shell membrane helps to prevent bacteria from getting into the egg. That little bubble, that airspace, and the shell membrane also helps maintain the moisture inside. The airspace is important too. It acts as sort of a shock absorber. So if the egg gets jostled around inside of the nest, helps protect the young in there. Also, when the chick is just about to hatch, it pokes its beak into that air cell and takes its first breath. How about the yolk? What is the yolk? John?
It's what was gonna be the chicken.
That's what a lot of people think. I was hoping somebody would say that. It's actually not. The yolk is not what becomes the chick. It's used by the chick. What's it used for, Luke?
Isn't it like the food?
Yeah, it's nutrients. The yolk is mainly fat and then some vitamins and minerals. And so that fat is a source of energy that allows the chick to grow and survive. Okay? It doesn't really eat the yolk, it absorbs the yolk. Again, Kiara asked about, well, sometimes people will make like an egg white omelet or just have egg whites instead of a whole egg. Why do they do that? Savannah?
Isn't the egg white like more healthy?
The egg white is basically protein. And if a person is trying to cut down the amount of fat they're eating or maybe the amount of calories, they might not eat the yolks because that's where most of the calories and all of the fat are in an egg, is in the egg yolk. So sometimes people eat egg whites. The yolk membrane holds the yolk together. How about those little stringy things attached to the yolk? Can you guess what they do? Sophia? Yeah, it sort of holds the yolk in place. They kind of stretch from one side of the egg to another, suspending the yolk in the middle of the egg so it doesn't just sort of droop to the bottom. Albumin, like we said, is just another word for the egg white. And egg white's a good source of protein. And as the embryo is growing, it absorbs that protein and water and uses it to grow. That little spot on the yolk, that white spot, inside of that, that's called the blastoderm. Inside of that is the cell where the sperm would actually fertilize an egg cell itself and would become the embryo. So it's not the yolk that would become the embryo, it's this tiny little cell that's in a patch on the yolk called the blastoderm. And after fertilization, cell division starts and grows into 2 cells and 4 and 8 and so forth, and eventually to the whole animal. For a chicken, for example, it takes about 3 weeks for a chick to go from the egg being laid to the chick hatching. Happens pretty quickly. Here's what it sort of looks like, the stage, if you're to look inside of the egg. After 5 days, okay, see here, the embryo itself is pretty small. The yolk is pretty big. What happens as time goes by? How do things change, Rihanna?
Like, everything gets smaller except for the chick.
Yeah, the chick gets larger, and all the other parts get smaller, because the chick is using the albumin. It's using the yolk as its energy to grow. Eventually, by 20 days, it's fully formed and about ready to hatch. We look at the parts of the fertilized egg. The thing that's going to develop into the chick, we call it the embryo. What's this? That's the yolk. What's this? Albumin, the egg white. Then there's a couple other things. There's a little bubble, a little membrane surrounding the embryo. It's called the amnion. And then there's another membrane called the allantois. The embryo is the chick that's growing. The allantois is used for waste and for breathing. And then the amnion is just another membrane to help protect, cushion the embryo as it grows. Now, the chick doesn't like eat. It's not like chewing up and swallowing the yolk. That's not how it gets the energy. It's actually attached to the yolk through these vessels. They bring the yolk in to the bird's body. These are called the yolk vessels. And at the same time, waste and oxygen diffuse in through these allantoic vessels. So again, have the embryo and the amnion, the yolk membrane, the allantois, and then these vessels that bring this stuff into the chick, called the yolk vessels and the allantoic vessels. The allantoic vessels are used for breathing, and the yolk vessels are used to absorb the nutrients. So, show you this animation. This is like, it's not actual images, but it's animated. But you can get an idea about how the embryo, the chick embryo develops over time. See how it grows. And then we'll talk briefly about one other thing. Well, this is showing on a hand out your homework. And then there's questions that go wrong. There's some questions that go along with it. Questions are homework. Yeah? Yes. And when they hatch, they're kind of like wet and their feathers aren't all fluffy. It takes a little while for that to. So when you buy eggs around here at the grocery store, is there a chick inside of there?
No.
What if you incubated it?
Yes.
Would it develop into a chicken?
No.
No. Why not? Why wouldn't those eggs develop into an embryo? Grace?
Is it not fertilized?
Yeah, they're not fertilized. So when in a farm, when they raise chickens for egg production, they don't keep a male rooster around the hens. And if there's no male rooster around, it can't mate with the hens, and therefore the eggs aren't fertilized. The hens will still continue, though, to release eggs, but they're not fertilized and have no possibility of ever growing into an embryo. But you can buy fertilized chicken or duck eggs. It's actually a common food in some place like in Southeast Asia, like the Philippines. It's called balut, and it's a fertilized egg that has the chick inside has started developing, and then it's cooked and usually eaten with like soy sauce or vinegar, and you basically take off the top of the shell, sip out like the juice inside, and then you eat the insides, which is like the albumin, the embryo of the egg. It's like a tiny little chicken inside there. This is like a store where they're called balut, and it's really common. You could get them on the street, you get them in a store, and that's what the inside looks like. You have like the yolk that still hasn't been absorbed yet, and then the embryo and stuff inside. The bones haven't calcified yet, so it's not like you're chewing up hard bone. They're soft, and you can just chew it up. And yeah.
From that's not, and I've seen those,
Did you ever try it?
I tried like the stuff inside, but not
Like the juice?
not the chicken.
Yeah, and it's very common. It's really, if you think, it's no different than chicken, really. Like if you eat chicken, it's the same thing as balut. Served different ways, kind of like a delicacy. We don't have time to watch that video, but you could see, or maybe watch a little bit of it. You could see what it looks like, the inside, and so forth.